Right, that was the ding. Okay, we'll cut over to the slides now. I don't have anything, I don't have any particular show and tell for you for this part of the lecture, but you can pretty much go outside and do your own show and tell with the next eukaryote group I want to talk about, and that is, of course, the plants. Almost all plants are photosynthetic. And again, that means that solar energy, sunlight is their energy source, and they use that to build complex molecules out of simple ones like carbon dioxide gas, water, nitrogen, and a few other minerals. And the green substance in plant cells that's actually used to capture solar energy is called chlorophyll. That's what makes plants green. There are a few plants that lack chlorophyll. They're actually parasitic, meaning that they live at the expense of another organism. Their roots may actually grow into another plant and steal its food, steal the sugars that that plant makes. There's actually some that are pretty common around here. But with those goofy exceptions, almost all plants are photosynthetic, and they all use chlorophyll. The cells are found inside cell walls, again, kind of a box-like structure in which the actual cell is found. And in bacteria, those are made of, in part, peptidoglycan. In fungi, they're made of chitin. In plants, they're made of cellulose. And so cellulose includes things like wood is largely cellulose, paper is largely cellulose, linen cloth is largely cellulose, cotton is largely cellulose. And when the cell wall is mature, it prevents a plant cell from expanding in size. Once the cell wall's been laid down, the plant cell can't grow. Just like once you've built a house, you can't make a room larger except by breaking the walls and rebuilding them somehow. Short of doing something catastrophic like that, once you have finished building a room in your house, that room is always going to be the same size. Same thing with plant cell walls. And many functioning cells in a plant are actually dead when they're mature. The cell grows a cell wall and then dies, and all that's left is this empty cell wall. That sounds odd, but almost all of a tree is dead. The wood inside the inner bark is made up of cells that are dead, and yet they're functional because those empty cell walls act as long pipes that can carry water from the roots to the rest of the tree. We'll look at that in a little more detail in just a bit. This, by the way, is how you can get hollow trees, how you can get trees that lose wood from the inside and don't die. It's because the wood that they're losing inside is already dead, and the tree can live a long time with the internal wood rotted out and destroyed until eventually it loses so much that it falls over in a storm or something like that. Oh, and then finally, cells on the outside of a plant are surrounded by a wax layer called a cuticle. You can feel this on really hard leaves, like magnolia is a good one to try this. If you take a magnolia leaf and you scrape it with your fingernail, you'll actually scrape up tiny whitish flakes of wax. There's other plants that have lots of wax on their leaves, like wax myrtle, that's why it's called that, or barberry, or tallow tree is another one where the wax is really thick, and sometimes that wax can be harvested, used to make candles and things. But even where it's not as thick, external cells are surrounded with that wax layer, the cuticle, that reduces water that's lost from the leaves. So that is a cross-section through a leaf. That's a slice through a leaf that's been mounted on a microscope slide. And we don't need to worry about everything that you see, except you can see that, first of all, it's made up of cells. Duh. The kind of dark green staining borders of the cells, that's the actual cell wall. And you might be able to see that the upper and lower cells have a thick cell wall, and it's a lot weaker on the cells on the inside of the leaf. And we don't need to worry about all of the types, but above and below, you can see we have kind of oval to squarish sorts of cells. Below that top layer, we've got a layer of, 2 layers actually, of very long and narrow cells called the palisade mesophyll, if you're keeping score at home. Below that, you've got a layer of kind of irregular cells with spaces in between. That's called the spongy mesophyll. There's cells on the underside of the leaf that actually allow carbon dioxide gas to pass through. Those are guard cells. And then kind of in the middle, you can see some empty spaces. That's cells making up the leaf veins. So I'm counting at least 5 major cell types in this field of view. That's what I mean by cell differentiation. Cells with different shapes, different sizes, different positions, and different functions, carrying out different aspects of life. And that's just in one leaf. You would have different cells if you looked in the bark or the roots. I mentioned there's a few plants that are not photosynthetic, and this is one that I've actually seen I've got some horse pasture not too far from where I live, and that had some little bushes in it a couple of years ago, and some of those bushes got hit by a plant called dodder, genus Cuscuta, and there's a bush under that tangle of golden filaments, that stuff that looks like golden, I don't know, fishing line or something like that, and that green bush under the filaments is being killed because those filaments, the stuff that looks like yellow hair, penetrates into the host plants and takes nutrients directly away from them. And this will eventually kill the host plant. So that's an example of a plant that isn't photosynthetic, and it's one that you could observe around here. I don't know exactly where to tell you to go, but I have seen it in this part of the world. And there's a few others that are non-photosynthetic, but the vast majority of plants are. They carry out photosynthesis, and they are autotrophs. They build up large molecules on their own using small molecules and solar energy. And to do this, plants use a green substance. By the gods, don't try to memorize what you see up here. This diagram is the chemical formula of the green substance called chlorophyll. Technically, they actually have 2 different types of chlorophyll called chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. We're not going to get into it as to why that matters. Photosynthesis involves some really amazing chemical wizardry that we're not going to get into. It's beautiful and it's awesome, and you're all perfectly capable of learning it, and we just don't have time. Let's just say that chlorophyll is what actually does the work of absorbing light energy and is able to convert it into chemical energy, which in turn drives the plant's ability to take in carbon dioxide and turn it into sugars. And that's what happens to some of the sugars. What you're looking at there is a maple tree, and the maple tree has had a little metal spout called a spile, if you're curious, driven into the bark. And there is sweet sap dripping out of it and being collected in a glass bottle that you're only seeing the neck of. Well, the sweet sap is rich in sugar, notably the sugar glucose. And you can use glucose to build more complicated sugars. You can use it to build other molecules, or you can use it to run the plant's metabolism. And glucose comes from the combination of carbon dioxide gas and water using solar energy to make it all happen. Incidentally, that maple sap will have to be boiled down, but once you boil it until it gets nice and thick, you've got real maple syrup. Which, by the way, you should try if you can. It's 1,000 times better than the artificial pancake topping. It's really good. Right. Just because this is the kind of thing you can see in the Ozarks in the fall, I'll mention that many plants contain other types of pigments, not just chlorophyll, but they may contain yellow pigments called xanthophylls, or orange pigments called carotenoids, and red, purple, and blue pigments called anthocyanins. You'll see these in other parts of a plant. Carrots look orange because they contain carotenoids. So do, tomatoes and things like that. Blueberries and blackberries and raspberries are red and blue and purple because they contain anthocyanins, and so on. These may not be visible in the leaves until fall, when the chlorophyll disappears. So they're always present in leaves of many plants. When it starts getting cool, the plant breaks down its chlorophyll, and you can see the other pigments that were always there. And you can see them for the first time, and now you have leaves changing color and looking quite beautiful if you've ever gone out and seen this in the fall. And then, of course, the leaves die and fall off the tree, and we go from fall to winter. But that's why they change color. They lose that chlorophyll, but that enables you to see other pigments of yellow, orange, and red. Okay, mature plant cells are surrounded by a cell wall. You can see it pretty well in this picture of the leaf of a water plant called Elodea. As I said, that cell wall is made of stuff called cellulose, unlike fungi and bacteria. In many plants, there's a second substance called lignin that connects cellulose molecules with each other to make an extremely tough network. Wood is tough because the cell walls are made up not only of cellulose, but lignin is added that locks those cellulose molecules together into something extremely tough and strong. You don't get lignin in things like, apples or celery or things like that, which are a lot softer and certainly a lot more pleasant to eat. It'd be kind of bad if apples were as tough as wood. This happens to be a microscope section of a slice through a buttercup root. You don't need to know everything that you're seeing, but in the middle you can see there's this X-shaped or cross-shaped bunch of circles. You're looking at this in cross-section, like taking a pile of pipes and looking at it edge on, right? If you look at it from the edge, you just see a bunch of circles. That's the view you're getting here. You're looking at sections through long pipe-shaped cells. And you can see that in the inside of that root, those pipe-shaped cells have very tough, thick walls that have stained pink. The cells that have lots of lignin in the cell walls are staining pink. The cells that don't have a lot of lignin, those cell walls look kind of green. So that's how you can see where the lignified tissue is. So yeah, a lot of interesting complexity there in a buttercup root. Incidentally, I think we've got a slide coming up that talks about this, but remember I was saying that in a functioning plant, many of the cells are actually dead. Those pipe-like cells that you're seeing on the inside making up that X shape, those are dead cells. You can see there's not anything in those cell walls. There's no organelles, there's no nucleus, there's nothing. And for this to be functional, the cells had to die. So the cells grew, they made those thick cell walls, and then they crumpled up and disappeared, leaving that thick cell wall behind to act like pipes for carrying water. Plant tissue that carries water is called xylem, Xylem. And what that cross is a big cross-shaped strand made of lots of xylem cells stuck together. If you want another example, if you've ever eaten celery and notice that it has these stringy things in it that sometimes get caught in your teeth, those stringy things in celery are strands of xylem. There's other cells involved too, but that's why they're so tough that they hold together and can make these strings that get stuck between your teeth. Okay, so there. And I mentioned that many plant tissues, the cell dies when it's functional. This happens to be cork, taken through a gizmo called a scanning electron microscope. We've actually got one at UCA. Could teach you how to use it one of these days. This is from the outer bark of a particular species of oak tree called the corkbark oak, because that outer layer is made up of many layers of cells in which the cell is dead and only the cell wall is left behind. So you can see that in cross-section, this cork is only just a bunch of empty cell walls, because the cell dies when the tissue matures. This, by the way, means that you can peel the cork layer off of a cork oak and not hurt the tree, and in fact, it will grow back because you're only peeling off dead cells. It hurts the tree no more than you getting a haircut or you scraping off dandruff. That's your equivalent of dead cells falling off of you. It doesn't particularly hurt the oak, which is why people use this stuff for, sealing wine bottles. It's a renewable product. Okay, right. You still hanging in there? I hope so. What's been done there is that's a plant stem that's been sliced down the middle. That's what longitudinal section means. It's been sliced right down the center. And those things that look like arms reaching up are leaves branching off the stem. And then right at the very tip, there is a little cap of cells called an apical meristem. That is the only place where cells are actively dividing. The cells of that apical meristem have very weak cell walls that can still stretch and can still expand. So that's the only part where the plant is actually getting longer. Most plants grow from the tip. So those apical meristem cells are growing. They're constantly dividing. They're leaving cells behind them that get longer and longer, but eventually mature and stop growing. So a tree doesn't grow from the base. If you have a tree that has a branch that is 5 feet above the ground, it will always be 5 feet above the ground. Trees grow only at the tips of their branches. And they grow it because they have this little cap of very weak but actively dividing cells called an apical meristem. And then there's lateral meristems along the sides that will grow into side branches of your plant. Incidentally, if you have a plant and you cut off the apical meristem, as long as the apical meristem is there, it blocks the lateral meristems from growing. But if you cut the apical meristem off a tip, the lateral meristems will start forming new branches, and your plant will become more branched and more bushy. That's the secret behind pruning. Right? If you've ever seen someone pruning a bush by trimming the ends of the branches, they do that because it will make the bush look, well, bushier by encouraging it to form side branches once you get rid of those apical meristems. And yeah, if you do it every season, you can end up with a very densely bushy plant, which is what, landscapers want to have. We're not going to have time to go into plant classification, but for what we've got to do here, I can divide plants into two different types. The first are bryophytes, which include moss, as well as some other things like liverworts and hornworts that you may not have seen. And mosses and other bryophytes are, as we say, non-vascular, which means that they don't have specialized cells for transporting water. Bryophytes cannot pipe water from roots to leaves. Since every cell needs water, bryophytes have some limitations on where they can grow. They have to live in places where every cell has access to water. So you tend to find mosses in places that stay moist pretty much permanently. There's lots of mosses and other bryophytes like liverworts growing in the splash zone of Cedar Falls at Petit State Park, if you've ever been up that way. If you walk in the forest, you tend to find mosses in kind of shady, low-lying areas that tend to stay damp year-round. You can find mosses in deserts, be it said, but mosses in deserts actually have the ability to dry out and go into suspended animation and then come back. So there are mosses that can tolerate drying out, but mosses can't grow unless all of the moss has access to water, because mosses can't transport water from roots to leaves, because mosses are non-vascular plants, the word for which is bryophyte. Almost all the plants that you've ever seen, except for the mosses, are called tracheophytes. Tracheo, you ought to think of your own trachea, right? That's the tube that carries air from your mouth down to your bronchi and then into your lungs. That's your trachea. Tracheophytes they don't exactly breathe air, but just like your trachea is basically a big pipe, tracheophytes are the ones that have specialized cells that are shaped like pipes that transport water and also transport nutrients all through the plant. So they're in the stems, they're in the veins that you can see on these leaves. Most of wood is made up of what we call vascular tissue, these specialized cells that transport water and nutrients. And so you can have very large trees in very dry areas because roots can pick up water from the soil and transport it all through the plant through that vascular tissue, those specialized cells that can carry water from the ground all the way to the top of the tree. This happens to be a slice through an alfalfa stem, and you can actually see that there are two types of conducting tissue. The round circles are this very tough, strong, lignin-rich conducting tissue where the cells are dead when they're functional. And that type of conducting tissue is called xylem, X-Y-L-E-M. Xylos happens to be Greek for wood, like a xylophone means wood that makes a sound. Phono means a sound. And xylem is the tissue that makes up most wood. Wood is pretty much solid xylem. Surrounding it, you've got a second type of conducting tissue that takes sugar from the leaves where it's being made by photosynthesis and transports it through the rest of the plant. That type of conducting tissue is called phloem. Not phlegm, that's something different. Phloem. So xylem transports water from the roots up to the rest of the tree. Phloem transports sap, sugar water basically, from the leaves down to the rest of the plant. So every living cell in a plant can get the water it needs and can get the nutrients that it needs, the sugars that it needs for energy. Oofta. Okay, you're still with me. We got one more kingdom to go. This is, of course, the kingdom Animalia. Now, when most people hear the word Animalia, they think of animals of the sort that you could find in a zoo. They tend to think of adorable mammals like this snow leopard, Unsia unsia, which is fuzzy and adorable and would eat you if it ever got the chance. For that matter, my cats are kind of like that. They're also fuzzy, adorable, and would eat me if I were smaller and they were bigger. And this is the kind of thing that most people will think of when you think of animal. But insects are also animals, like this common white-tailed dragonfly, which you can see around here at about this time. Animal is not restricted only to the mammals, the critters that have a backbone and hair and feed their babies with milk. By far the largest phylum in the kingdom Animalia is the phylum Arthropoda, which includes insects, as well as crustaceans like crabs and lobsters and crawfish and shrimp, and spiders and scorpions and other arachnids and so on. All those things that have lots of legs that have joints in them are in the kingdom Animalia. And I'm saying this because I've had students before that didn't realize that animal includes lots of things other than the familiar mammals that you know. In fact, the great majority of animals are arthropods, bugs, basically. And even things like this. This is soft and fleshy. It glows in the dark. It lives on the ocean floor where the bottom is very soft, and it looks like a feather. It's called Panatula phosphorea. This is not the kind of thing that people tend to think of as an animal. If you saw one of these and you didn't already know, you might think it was some kind of weird seaweed or something like that. You know, this certainly does not look an awful lot like a snow leopard or even a dragonfly. So where do we get off calling this an animal? Here's how. Animals are multicellular. They've got cell differentiation. The simplest of animals might only have 4 cell types. Mammals, including you, might have roughly 200 cell types. Dragonflies are kind of in between. Generally speaking, most animals are heterotrophic, which means feeding on others. Heterotrophic organisms must feed on other living things as a source both of the energy that they need to run their metabolism and of the molecules that they use to build their own bodies. So you are heterotrophic because you get your energy and you also get the molecules that you need to make new cells and tissues. All of that comes from other living things that you eat, you know, like the cow that ended up in your Big Mac, for example. Okay, if you're a vegetarian, the soybeans that ended up in your meat substitute patties, or, you know, whatever. Most animals at least some stage of the life cycle are motile. They're capable of moving. Plants generally don't do this. You've never seen trees running past the, okay, except for ants, okay, but those are made up. Those are just in Lord of the Rings. You know, last time I went to see Two Towers, in the scene where the Ents were marching on Isengard, I stood up in the middle of the movie and yelled, "Run, Forrest, run!" And got beaten up and thrown out. But anyway, yeah, actual plants don't pick up their roots and run, but a great many animals are capable of it. Most animals are motile at least some part of the life cycle, if not always the entire thing. Animals usually have some type of symmetry, which means that the bodies can be divided into halves that are mirror images of each other. Not that I would ever do such a thing, but if I went crazy and had a samurai sword, In theory, I could slice you right down the middle and cut you into a left half and a right half, and those two halves are the same shape. They're just mirror images of each other. And again, I would not do such a thing, but that's what we mean when we talk about symmetry. Most animals have bodies that can be divided into equal-sized mirror image halves. Many animals have more than one way you can do this. Animals don't have cell walls. So bacteria do, protists, some do and some don't. Fungi do, animals don't. What locks animal cells together, among other things, is a meshwork of fibers that we call the extracellular matrix. That doesn't form a wall, but it forms connecting fibers that holds everything together in a sort of net. In some parts of an animal body, the net may be very tight, almost like a felt. In others, it might be a lot looser, but that's what ultimately locks your cells together. That and a few other types of tricks that they have for riveting themselves, but they don't use cell walls. All animals, except for the very simplest, have cells organized in coordinated groupings, often shaped like sheets. And those coordinated groupings that are specialized for just one thing are called tissues. So what does this look like? This is actually a piece of human tissue. It's a type of tissue called connective tissue. Connective tissue is used for structure and support. Your bones are connective tissue. Your tendons are connective tissue, like the Achilles tendon that you can feel at the back of your heel. That's connective tissue. Your cartilage is connective tissue. And this is a sample of the stuff under the skin of your face. It's called loose alveolar tissue. It's not your muscles. It's not fat, although that's another connective tissue. It is a whole bunch of cells, and the way they're stained, they're showing up as these dark dots. And the dark dots look like they're embedded in this stuff that looks like blue cotton candy. It's not really cotton blue, of course. This has been stained to bring out detail. But all of that stringy blue material is mostly a protein called collagen. There's other proteins in there as well. And they make up this network that's locking all of those cells together, this network called the extracellular matrix. Incidentally, when you're young, your cells are very good at repairing that collagen. You know, they can tear down old collagen and lay down new collagen, and that gives your skin that and face that pleasing plumpness that it has when you're young. As you age, you start losing the ability to repair your collagen, or you can't keep up with it quite as well. And your connective tissue begins to sag and you start getting wrinkles. Not to fear, you can actually get injections of collagen under the skin of places like your face or your lips, or for that matter, your behind, to plump those up and make them all, nice and firm and round again. This is the kind of thing that cosmetic surgeons have been known to do, injecting collagen to directly replenish that extracellular matrix that is holding together the cells under the skin of your face. So there. Blood is actually a specialized tissue. This is a slide of human blood. Most of those round things that you're seeing are red blood cells. Mature red blood cells don't have nuclei in them. But they bud off of cells in places like your bone marrow that do have nuclei. So they come from nucleated cells. So it's okay, you're still a eukaryote, even though some of your cells lose their nuclei. Up at the upper left, you've got a single white blood cell. That grainy thing that looks a little like a four-leaf clover is actually the nucleus. White blood cells have nuclei that can take some kind of funky shapes. And in blood, the extracellular matrix happens to be not a solid protein filaments, but a liquid called your plasma. You may have, for some reason, I keep getting ads asking me to donate plasma. Plasma is just the liquid part of your blood. They can separate the cells from the plasma and use the plasma for various medical treatments, and use the cells separately for other things. Right. There's 4 basic tissue types, and you do need to know these. Tissue that lines cavities or lines things that are open to the outside is called epithelial tissue. Your skin is epithelial tissue. The lining of your lungs and your trachea is epithelial tissue. The lining of your digestive tract from one end to the other is epithelial tissue. The lining of the tubes inside your kidneys and the tubes that make up whatever reproductive system you happen to be blessed with is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue can often be modified for secreting things, not just lining a cavity, but secreting stuff. So the cells in your salivary glands that produce your saliva are epithelial tissue. The cells in your pancreas that produce certain digestive enzymes, that's epithelial tissue. So anything that lines cavities or lines a place where you're exposed to the outside would be epithelial tissue. Your sweat glands and your sebum glands, the glands that make the oil that covers your skin and hair, that's epithelial tissue. Connective tissue is used for structural support, and we actually talked about that a minute ago. You've got bone, cartilage, tendons. Blood is technically connective tissue. Anything that holds you up and locks you together would be connective. Tissues that is used to transmit signals is nervous tissue, and your brain is nervous tissue. Some days it's more nervous than others. And your spinal cord would be nervous tissue, and your actual nerves would be nervous tissue. And then finally, muscle tissue is tissue that can contract and is used in motion. So much of your heart is muscle tissue. Certainly your actual muscles are muscle tissue. So just for looks, here's some epithelial tissue. This happens to be human fallopian tubes, the tube that conveys eggs from the ovary into the uterus. And this particular epithelial tissue, the cells are actually shaped kind of like columns, or shaped like very long boxes standing on end. Inside some of these cells, you can see rounded things. That's the actual nuclei. And this is a type of epithelial tissue that happens to be called columnar epithelium. The epithelial tissue that lines your skin is actually made not of column-shaped cells, but of very flat cells, almost like tiles on a floor, sticking together edge to edge. So your skin is a slightly different type of epithelium. Connective tissue here, this is human cartilage. Those light kind of rounded things that you see are where the actual cells go. And surrounding those light areas where the cells go, you have all of this stuff that's stained pink right there. That's the very thick and tough extracellular matrix that your cartilage has. And that can vary. It can be very flexible, like the cartilage in your nose, or a lot harder and tougher, like the cartilage in your joints. Nervous tissue, that is what human brain tissue looks like, and all of the stringy things that you're seeing are nerve cells of various kinds, transmitting signals. And then that's what muscle tissue looks like. This is just some human skeletal muscle. The dark spots that you're seeing there are nuclei of the cells. But almost all of the muscle cells is packed full of specialized proteins that stains kind of pink here and has this banded shape. We don't really need to get into why it's got that shape, but that shape is what enables muscle to contract, which is what muscle tissue does. In some of the simplest animals, like the ones we place in the phylum Cnidaria, which includes jellyfish and also corals and sea anemones and things like that, the body is just made up of several types of tissue folded together like sheets of tissue paper. But in most animals, you'll get several tissues that will form integrated units called organs. So what you're looking at is a slice through an organ. This happens to be the wall of the human small intestine. The inside of the intestine is up at the top of this picture. And the topmost layer of cells that you can see is epithelial tissue. It's tissue that lines the inside of the small intestine, secretes things like mucus that help your food pass through, and absorbs the molecules from the breakdown of the food that you've just eaten. So that's epithelium on the inside. Just below it, you've got a layer of connective tissue that's kind of spongy looking. And below that, you've got two layers of muscle tissue that contract and do the work of squeezing food through the small intestine, where your body absorbs as much of it as it can and then expels the rest in the form of feces. So the walls of your intestine, you have an epithelial layer, you've got some connective tissue under that, you've also got connective tissue on the outside that holds the whole thing together. You have thick muscle tissue layers, and it's not obvious in this picture, but you've got nerves that control the whole thing that are nervous tissue. So your intestine is made up of all four tissue types integrated into this complex unit, and a unit like that is called an organ. I assume you have heard of internal organs. Several organs integrated together make up an organ system. I'm not going to make you learn them all, but in human anatomy, we typically recognize 16. This is one of them. This is the human digestive system. So you have organs like the esophagus, the stomach, the liver, the spleen, the gallbladder, the pancreas, the small intestine, the large intestine. Wow, we're having an organ recital. Get it? Get it, music majors? Get it? Right. And again, there's about 15 others recognized in human anatomy that you might encounter if you end up taking any courses in health sciences or medicine down the road. And it is 11:47, and that would happen to be all I particularly care to cover today. We actually went through it a little faster than maybe I needed to. So I am going to cut back to the regular camera, and I'm going to ask if there are any questions, and I will go ahead and stop recording, and we'll pick this up on Monday.